This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. South Korea's embattled President Yoon skips a second day of questioning, further stalling a criminal probe into his brief martial law bid. Details and analysis of his media strategy. A Taiwanese chip-making giant TSMC posts a record rise in net profit for the fourth quarter on AI-driven demand for chips, even as it navigates the US-China tech rivalry. A last-minute snag, the Israeli Prime Minister accuses Hamas of backtracking on parts of a Gaza ceasefire deal, delaying its expected approval today. And US President Joe Biden, in his farewell address, warns of a grave threat to democracy, power and wealth, increasingly concentrated in the hands of a select ultra-wealthy few. Also in East Asia tonight, eerie sounds blaring from speakers in North Korea are driving those in the south to the breaking point. Some are hanging on to one last glimmer of hope, the return of Donald Trump to the White House. And COVID-19 prompted an exodus of expats from Shanghai. But 4 years on, why aren't they coming back? We'll take a closer look. It's day 2 of South Korean President Yoon in detention, and a court has begun a review process to determine if the arrest of the impeached leader was made in accordance with the law. Mr. Yoon's legal team filed the application yesterday, claiming the improper arrest of the leader, and requested the court to order his release. His team added that the investigating agency, the Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranking Officials, or CIO, lacks the legal authority to investigate insurrection charges. Well, local media say that the results of the hearing are expected to come out as early as tonight. Well, this comes as Mr. Yoon failed to show up for a second day of questioning with investigators. They're looking into whether he committed insurrection with his short-lived martial law bid last month. He was questioned for nearly 11 hours yesterday after a dramatic arrest, but chose to remain silent. The embattled leader was originally scheduled to speak to authorities this afternoon, but his aides now say he will not be attending it at all, citing health reasons. The country's constitutional court, meantime, held the second oral arguments hearing in the trial of Mr. Yoon's impeachment over his martial law declaration. The first session ended within minutes after Mr. Yoon failed to show up earlier this week. The Constitutional Court must decide within 180 days whether to remove Mr. Yoon from office or restore his presidential powers. Supporters of Mr. Yoon are keeping up with their protests against his arrest, calling it illegitimate. They are waving signs and chanting outside the Seoul Detention Center where the leader is being held. And earlier, my colleague Yasmin Yonkers spoke to Mason Ritchie, Associate Professor of International Politics from the Hankook University of Foreign Studies. And he explained to us what could be behind Mr. Yoon's latest move.
What we understand is that he refused to make any statements to the investigators after his detention and after being brought into the investigative office for questioning. And, that seems to be a part of his larger strategy, if I can call it that, which doesn't for the moment seem to involve really trying to win either in the beginning of this criminal investigation for insurrection and abuse of power, but perhaps also in the Constitutional Court, we'll see, through the prospect of winning on the merits of his case. Rather, he seems to be trying to win this battle through political means, through shaping public opinion, through trying to get the conservative base on his side, and at the same time, essentially trying to delegitimize the investigation as well as the impeachment. So he's trying to really win the battle through the court of public opinion rather than, I think, through legal means. And that's probably because, at least so far as we know, the evidence that's against him is overwhelming. I also think he really disdains the investigation into him as well as the joint investigative body that's carrying it out. And he doesn't want to do anything that would seem to legitimize that, partially because, for all we know, he really does have the conviction that this joint investigative body is illegitimate. And in that sense, I think that there's an element of sort of self-convincing, or if you want to be uncharitable about it, an element perhaps of delusion in his strategy.
And for more insights, we are joined now by Kyujin Shim, assistant professor in digital media and communication from IE University, and she is speaking to us from Madrid. Well, thanks so very much for joining us this evening, Professor. I just want to pick up from that soundbite we heard from Professor Mason, who suggested that there is an element of delusion in President Yoon's strategy, particularly his attempt to win the battle by, shaping public opinion through all sorts of political maneuvering. So, Professor Shim, do you think that is a fair assessment, or is there something else to Yoon's approach that we're missing out here?
Some missing point is that there are three key reasons why the Yoon's approval rating is surging now. So first thing is people are starting to focus on fairness. So especially men in their 20s and 30s who are very digital savvy, and they know how to use YouTube to spread out the message, which the traditional and mainstream media ignore. They tend to value meritocracy and fairness, and they often see policies like affirmative actions as unfair. And Yoon taps into this sentiment with messages about equal opportunity, and also actually the Constitutional Court, the way they handle the Yoon's case is totally different than the way they handle the opposition party leader, the Lee Jae-myung, who are charged with a lot of convictions and criminal and corruption convictions. So that's why some people, especially swing voters, they start to think about whether the way the mainstream media and mainstream elite politics treat President Yoon is really fair or unfair. And also there's some anti-China stance, anti-China movement nowadays in South Korea is very prevalent. And then Yoon's top policies on North Korea and China is pretty much aligned with strong national security views of those swing voters and the general people who are against the political elite. And also people tend to focus on economic freedom and freedom of speech. So Yoon promotes free markets and individual success.
Yeah, Professor, I just want to pick up on what you're talking about, how, Yoon is trying to appeal to a certain population, the manosphere, which is kind of what's similar to what Trump has been doing. And he seems to be doubling down on his conservative base. So, he's asking them to, watch YouTube rather than traditional media, for instance. So do you think this is a calculated strategy to reshape his public narrative?
Exactly. So it seems that the Yoon successfully changing the narratives, his narratives, unlike traditional media perceive him. So allegedly, mainstream media leans progressive and is often critical of President Yoon. And in response, right-wing voices have found a home on YouTube and challenging these narratives and then building support for Yoon. Also, there's another issue that has backlashed. And then the Democratic Party's policies like monitoring private messages and regulating fake news are also very controversial nowadays. Younger generations see these measures as authoritarian, driving them further away from traditional media and politics.
Yeah, so aside from YouTube, I'm curious to know, the South Koreans, in terms of following the latest developments on Yoon, for instance, and all the political upheaval in Seoul, where else are they turning to?
Actually, as you suggest, the Yoon strategy is is mirroring what Trump did to make a comeback after the election, after the presidential election. So the slogan "Stop the Steal" gained traction through online communities and right-wing YouTubers, and also the micro-influencers who are stands for more free economic measures and free trade kind of thing. So it resonated with people who doubted the election process and they wanted to challenge its fairness. So just like in the US, this slogan became a rallying cry for those who felt marginalized, and it helped unify right-wing voters who are skeptical of the elite system.
Right. And to what extent would you say social media platforms, like YouTube, for instance, has become a rallying point for these protesters? Like how are these digital spaces being used to, whether it's to mobilize support or to amplify messages or counteract opposition narratives?
Actually, it also heavily associated with the underdog effect. Traditionally, Koreans try to support who are underdog rather than alpha dog. So Yoon's growing popularity among especially younger generations and swing voters can be attributed to the underdog effect, and where he is perceived as a weaker figure standing up against powerful forces. So in fact, Yoon personally gained significant attention by sending video messages himself directly to his supporters and showcasing a more relatable and vulnerable side. So he has successfully shifted the narrative and presenting himself as a victim of unfair investigations and a leader who prioritized avoiding bloodshed, even in the face of adversity. So that's his own narrative, and he mobilized support through the YouTube and new media and video message to his supporters.
Yeah, and we can certainly see that in terms of the videos that he has released. But I want to talk about overall South Korea's media landscape at this point. How would you characterize the role of local media in terms of covering this political crisis? A lot of people are saying that it is polarized. Yoon, for one, has suggested that. And how do you think that has shaped public discourse during this period?
I think the digital divide, generational gap is very severe and intense in South Korea. So especially Yoon has a very strained, very challenging and very tensional relationship with traditional media outlets. And the relationship is getting worse and worse, and then it's almost out of control. So nowadays, South Korea's media landscape is changing very fast. And actually, based on poll, traditional media outlets are losing their influence. And while platforms like YouTube and also micro-influencers are becoming more powerful. So mainstream media leans very against President Yoon. So that trend will be more, increasing nowadays. Yeah, I project the overall the media landscape, in South
thanks
Korea.
so very much for sharing with us your perspectives on South Korea's evolving media landscape. Kyujin Shim, Assistant Professor in Digital Media and Communication from IE University. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Hamas of backtracking on some details of the Gaza ceasefire deal that was agreed upon overnight. Hamas, however, says it is committed to the agreement announced by mediators. The Israeli leader's comments come ahead of a vote in his cabinet to approve the truce. But Mr. Netanyahu now says that lawmakers will not convene until mediators notify Israel that Hamas has accepted all the elements of the agreement. Israel's acceptance of the deal will not be official until the cabinet approves it. Well, the vote is expected to be a contentious one, with two far-right ministers publicly opposing the deal, calling it bad and disastrous. The agreement comes after months of negotiations involving mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. It's based on a proposal by U.S. President Joe Biden and takes effect on Sunday, the eve of Donald Trump's presidential inauguration. It comprises 3 phases. The first will last 6 weeks, during which Israeli forces will completely pull out from populated areas in Gaza. Hamas will release 33 hostages taken during its October 7th attacks in 2023, including women, the elderly, and children, in exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israel. Well, talks are still needed to get to the second phase, which negotiators hope will see a permanent end to the war. This means a complete Israeli troop withdrawal before another exchange of hostages and prisoners. And in a final phase, the bodies of dead Israeli hostages will be returned. Reports say about a third of the 98 people held captive have died. Crossings into Gaza will reopen, and a reconstruction of the enclave will begin. Well, despite Israel's accusation that Hamas has reneged on the ceasefire, Palestinians in Gaza earlier celebrated news of the truce. As you can see there, people cheered, danced, and blew horns as they rejoiced over being able to return to what's left of their homes. They now wait for an anticipated influx of humanitarian aid and an end to Israeli airstrikes.
نحن هنا مبسوطين بهذا الانتصار لأن الشعب الفلسطيني يريد حريته فقط. الحرية للشعب الفلسطيني. لا نريد إلا الحرية ونعيش بكرامة من غير الاحتلال.
Celebrations in Israel, though, were more muted. The foreign minister reportedly said backing the deal that entails the release of Palestinian prisoners was not an easy decision. Now, many in Israel are concerned over the phased ceasefire plan that will release only some of their loved ones in the first stage.
It comes with feeling about all the hostages, because we know it's part of them, not all of them. And for us, it's only the beginning. We want them all here, okay? Because it's not end and it's not enough if just some of them will come.
Meantime, countries in Asia also welcoming the deal, calling on parties to uphold it for the sake of regional security. China's foreign ministry expressed hope that the agreement can be implemented effectively and lead to a complete and permanent ceasefire.
我们也真诚希望有关各方以加沙停火为契机，推动缓和地区紧张局势。中方将同国际社会一道，为推动中东地区实现和平稳定做出不懈努力。
Japan, meanwhile, lauded the deal while stressing the need for an enduring resolution.
我が国は引き続き関係国国際機関と緊密に意思疎通を行いつつ、ガザの人道状況の改善、復興及び統治に関する国際的な努力に積極的に関与するとともに、二国家解決及び長期的な地域の平和と安定の確立に向けた外交努力を重ねてまいります。
Coming up next on East Asia tonight, Washington adding yet more companies to their export blacklist, further throttling China's access to advanced chips. And later, U.S. private equity firm KKR may join the founding family of Seven & I to privatize the Japanese-listed company. Hello there. Good to have your company this Thursday evening. It is now time for your business update from Roland Lim. And Roland, I believe the world's largest chip maker ending 2024 on a high?
That's right. Taiwan's TSMC has logged record earnings for the last quarter of the year, fueling hopes for continued AI spending this year. Now, despite the chip rivalry between the US and China, it's another market-beating quarterly report card for TSMC, which has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of a global race to develop artificial intelligence. Net profit for the October to December period came in at $11.4 billion. That's a 57% increase on year and compares with an average profit estimate of $11.2 billion. This after the company disclosed better than expected sales last week. Revenue rose 39% to more than $26 billion for the quarter. The strong performance seen giving a boost to investors, hoping to see the AI hardware spending spree extend into 2025. It also extends a winning streak dating back years, as TSMC has outperformed profit estimates in all quarters but one since the summer of 2019. Despite continuing the sales momentum, the Taiwanese chip giant was also caught again in the crossfires of US-China chip war after its technology was found in Huawei's AI chips last year. Now, in response, the US has announced new export control rules on AI chips to curtail their flow to China. Apple remains TSMC's biggest customer, and iPhone sales are expected to be muted. But the firm's chief is hopeful that 2025 would be another strong year of growth for the company. TSMC shares closed more than 3% higher in Taiwan before the results were released, and it's up more than 5% in U.S. pre-market trading. They have rallied more than 90% in 2024, marking the biggest percentage gain since 1999. A day after blacklisting nearly 37 Chinese firms from exporting to the U.S., well, the Biden administration has done so again for 24 more for helping Huawei. 25 China-based companies and 2 Singapore-based companies have been added to its restricted trade list. Now, this includes Zhipu AI, that's a developer of large language models, as well as SoftGo. That's a company whose TSMC-made chip was illegally incorporated into a Huawei AI processor. Companies on the list are not allowed to receive goods or technology exports without a license, which is generally denied. The U.S. also tightened rules on exports of semiconductors that can be used for AI. The new rules follows curbs Washington placed on TSMC after discovery of its chip in Huawei's Ascend 910B multi-chip system. Now, Huawei was placed on the entity list in 2019 and is now at the center of China's AI chip ambitions. The latest regulation adds new controls for chip factories and packaging companies seeking to export certain chips. Now, these controls build on earlier measures aimed at hampering China's access to chips that could help its military. Meanwhile, Alibaba and Tencent-backed Zhipu says that it strongly opposes inclusion onto the entity list. Turning to the broader China markets, Hong Kong mainland bourses edged higher, joining the Asia-wide rally. Shanghai Composite gaining 0.3% today. Shenzhen up 0.4%, and Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index, well, Hong Kong stocks are at a 2-week high as investors gear up for key economic data set to be released tomorrow. Headline GDP will be in focus. China is expected to have met its full-year growth target of 5%. But a clutch of top-tier indicators from retail sales to industrial production is set to paint a more subdued picture as at the end of last year. The Bank of Korea unexpectedly held its benchmark interest rate steady despite a struggling South Korean economy battered by political turmoil and a deadly airline crash. The BOK kept its policy rate at 3%, ending its back-to-back easing streak that started in November, when the central bank unexpectedly cut borrowing costs, citing concerns over incoming U.S. President Donald Trump's potential tariffs. Analysts say standing pat still leaves open the possibility of a rate cut next month. The surprise move today comes as officials refrain from striking an overly confident tone in the face of political turbulence as well as high household debt, which has seen the Korean won to its weakest level in nearly 15 years. It is currently now trading weaker against the greenback, $1 giving you 1,457.27 won. And analysts say that the Korean currency likely to be hovering in the mid-1400s against the dollar through to the second half of the year. Remember, it surged past 1,400 range back in December in the aftermath of the failed martial law decree. That's a level not seen since the global financial crisis. U.S. private equity firm KKR is reportedly considering joining the founding family of 7&I Holdings in a management buyout proposal to privatize the Japanese-listed entity. KKR is said to be discussing the investment of several hundred billion yen for an equity stake in the operator of 7-Eleven convenience stores. KKR's possible involvement comes on the heels of U.S. investment firm Apollo weighing on a commitment of much as $9.6 billion to the buyout. The proposal began as an attempt to fend off an acquisition bid by Canadian rival Alimentation Couche-Tard, but has since become an enticing potential deal. It would involve about $25 billion in equity stakes, and the rest coming from bank financing. And that'll do it for Business, Utali.
Thanks so very much, Roland. Well, we're going to go for a break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight.
I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern.
That's right, Joe Biden sounding the alarm over the growing power of the ultra-rich as he prepares to step down from the presidency. You're watching East Asia Tonight. South Korea's embattled President Yoon skips a second day of questioning, further stalling a criminal probe into his brief martial law bid. Taiwanese chip-making giant TSMC posts a record 57% rise in net profit for the fourth quarter on AI-driven demand for chips, even as it navigates the US-China tech rivalry. And a last-minute snag in the Gaza ceasefire deal. The Israeli Prime Minister accuses Hamas of backtracking on parts of the agreement, delaying its expected approval today. Well, a Japanese government panel says that the likelihood of a so-called megaquake hitting the country in the next 30 years has risen to between 75 and 82%. Well, that's up slightly from the previous estimate of between 74 and 81%. Experts say that such an earthquake could potentially reach a devastating 8 to 9 magnitude on the Richter scale, triggering huge tsunamis and killing hundreds of thousands of people. Well, the estimates are for the probability of a megaquake in the Nankai Trough, where the Philippine Sea oceanic tectonic plate is slowly slipping underneath the continental plate that Japan sits on top of. Megaquakes have reportedly occurred in the trough every 1 or 2 centuries over the past 1,400 years. The last one recorded was in 1946. Well, that means it's been nearly 80 years since the last megaquake. One official saying that the probability of another big one will rise at the rate of about 1% every year. US President Joe Biden has warned of the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a very few in his farewell address to the nation. Though he did not mention names, his warning echoes previous speeches in which he cautioned against the threat posed by Trump and his backers to democracy.
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. We see the consequences all across America, and we've seen it before.
While wishing the incoming Trump administration well, Mr. Biden said that no president should be immune from crimes committed in the office. He warned that the same concentration of wealth and power was undermining the nation's freedoms, which could result in the abuse of power.
I'm equally concerned about the potential rise of a tech industrial complex that could pose real dangers for our country as well. Americans are being buried under an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation, enabling the abuse of power. The free press is crumbling. Editors are disappearing. Social media is giving up on fact-checking. The truth is smothered by lies told for power and for profit. We must hold the social platforms accountable to protect our children, our families, and our very democracy from the abuse of power.
China, in the meantime, has slammed comments from Donald Trump's Secretary of State nominee, Marco Rubio, who had earlier called Beijing the biggest threat to the U.S. during his Senate confirmation hearing. The Chinese Foreign Ministry stressed that Washington needs to stop unwarranted attacks and smear campaigns against China. It also emphasized that Beijing has handled bilateral relations based on principles of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. Mr. Rubio, who has bipartisan backing, touched on several global issues at the Senate hearing, but he focused mainly on China, warning against depending excessively on Beijing.
So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
China is also in Trump's crosshairs. The president-elect has threatened widespread tariffs on goods imported into the U.S. to tackle unfair trade. Well, he suggested a 10% universal import tariff and up to 60% on Chinese imports. Any change will impact international trade as well as American consumers. Caroline Malone has more from Washington.
Diferentes colores, pero todos son importados de México.
The future cost of trade with the United States is opaque. Wholesale business owner Mr. Flores imports tomatoes from Mexico. He fears any of the tariffs suggested by President-elect Trump will end up hurting consumers.
Cualquier tarifa es un impuesto más que nos afecta a todos. Sí, entonces, incluyendo al que compra una libra, al que compra dos, o al que compra 1,000 o 10,000 libras, todo el tiempo le va a afectar porque lo que nos cobran a nosotros se lo vamos a cobrar al consumidor.
In the last few years, consumer spending has remained strong, despite the economic challenges of inflation and interest rates, leading to a high cost of living, a major factor in Mr. Trump's re-election.
Tariffs will make our country rich. But won't they raise prices? Properly used.
The president-elect says tariffs will help, but it's unclear how. Organisations like the National Retail Federation have assessed the potential impact of tariffs. Vice President Jonathan Gold says tariffs can be used as a tool to address trade problems, but need to be strategic and focused.
We found that consumers would lose spending power between $46 to $78 billion. And this is on products, everyday essentials like apparel, footwear, home appliances, toys, travel goods. So, I think, again, as we're looking at tariffs, we want to make sure they're used in a strategic manner.
When Trump was last in charge, the US introduced tariffs on $360 billion worth of goods from China. Beijing fought back with reciprocal tariffs on US goods, leading to a trade war disrupting global supply chains and increasing the cost of business. Later, President Joe Biden further hiked tariffs on semiconductors and electric vehicles. Data estimates show that across the Trump and Biden administrations, these policies decrease US GDP by 0.2% and employment by 142,000 jobs. One stated aim of Trump's new tariff plan is to increase US manufacturing and reduce reliance on others like China. But it may also push US trade partners away.
For all of these countries, the relationship between the US and China is going to be an increasingly difficult one for them to balance, and Trump might make it easier for them to choose China, even while he's putting his finger on the scale to try and do exactly the opposite.
With Trump's return to the White House, it's unclear how many countries could be affected by new tariffs and whether they will introduce retaliatory measures. For President-elect Donald Trump, there is one clear motivation for tariffs, and that is revenue. He has pledged to cut income tax, at the same time to tackle border security, to defend national security and reduce illegal immigration. But with so much uncertainty, it's unclear who will pay the highest price. Caroline Malone, CNA, Washington.
And just a reminder that CNA will also bring you the inauguration ceremony live alongside analysis from our correspondents and experts. So do join us on the 21st of January, midnight, Singapore-Hong Kong time. Political observers and governments are also waiting to see the approach Donald Trump will take to major Asian issues, including tensions in the Korean Peninsula. Some South Koreans living near the border with the North are hoping that his return to the White House will bring about change. CNA's Korea correspondent Lim Yun-suk has this report.
It's like the soundtrack of a horror movie. But these haunting noises are from North Korea. These speakers on the north of the Inter-Korean border sometimes also broadcast loud, crackly noises, like a gong being beaten, or metal grinding sounds. They have been blaring every day since July, making life unbearable for South Koreans living near the border. Please save us, resident An Mi-hee pleaded in Parliament in late October. She's a resident of Tangsan-ri, one of the closest villages to North Korea and the hardest hit by this latest wave of psychological warfare.
이 딸이 바로 요 위에 살아요. 애기들이 1학년, 3학년짜리 학생애가 있어요. 그런데 걔네들이 잠을 못 자. 저 소리에 놀래갖고 구내염이 계속 생겨. 약도 져다 먹고 애들이 밥을 못 먹으니까 가서 닝기리도 맞아야 되고 그런 걸 보는 엄마는 또 얼마나 간절했겠어요.
Ms. Kim's husband An Hyo-chol says the sounds are affecting their mental health and are nothing like the propaganda broadcasts North Korea used to play.
저 김일성이 김 부자들 찬양 노래 극 같은 거 하고 또 그거는 시간이 12시다 뭐 1시다 딱 정해져서 있더랬어. 그때는 그러니까 지금은 지들 하고 싶은 대로 하고 여기 사람들 이 스트레스를 주기 위해서 하는 방송이야. 나 조금 왔을 때 적어도 총알도 막 날라왔어요. 근데도 이렇게 괴로운 적은 없더랬어요.
Residents say they have asked the Defense Ministry and other government officials for help, but the issue has not been resolved. Now they're holding on to a glimmer of hope that perhaps Donald Trump's return to the White House could help. Some residents here at Tangsan-ri village in Gangwon County, which is only about 1.7 kilometers away from where North Korea is, are hoping that when U.S. President-elect Donald Trump enters the White House, relations between the United States and North Korea will improve, as that will help reduce tension here on the Korean Peninsula. And most importantly for the residents here, they're hoping that will help stop North Korea from broadcasting these unbearable sounds. South Koreans remember how Mr. Trump met North Korea's Kim Jong-un 3 times between 2018 and 2019, though talks ended without an agreement from North Korea to denuclearize. As Mr. Trump takes office, experts say they think there is a possibility of another meeting.
양쪽도 만나고 싶어하는 것은 맞습니다. 다만 언제 어떻게 만날 것이냐가 중요하고요. 김정은 입장에서는 과거처럼 손쉽게 만나려고 하지 않을 겁니다. 물론 트럼프 집권 기간에 굉장히 짧은 평화이긴 했습니다만은요. 어떤 근본적인 해결과 뭐 이런 것을 바라는 것이 아니라 자기 재임 기간 동안의 그런 짧은 성과에 그것만 갖고도 충분히 자랑할 수 있기 때문에.
For those living along the border, they hope it contributes to at least a temporary easing of tensions in the Korean Peninsula and a reprieve from these eerie broadcasts. Lim Yeon-suk, Tangsan-ri Village, Gangwon County, South Korea.
For more on Trump's return to power and how the world braces for impact, catch CNA correspondent Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore-Hong Kong time. Now, ahead of his speech, Mr. Biden ordered a 2-year extension of a program that allows Hong Kong residents in the U.S. to stay even after their visas expire. Well, this is his second time extending the visa clemency program. Mr. Biden says he is offering safe haven for Hong Kong residents who have been deprived of their guaranteed freedoms, and that doing so advances U.S. interests in the region. Mr. Biden laid out what he called China's assault on Hong Kong's autonomy, citing the arrests of 200 of the city's politicians and activists. Well, the extension of the visa clemency program will likely add to tensions with Beijing. The incoming administration of Donald Trump also vowing to confront what it calls a dangerous China. Coming up next on East Asia Tonight, a special report on why Shanghai is increasingly less attractive for expats. CNA's Guan joins us after this break. CNA has rolled out a new documentary taking a closer look at China's most populous city, Shanghai. The metropolis suffered a well-documented exodus of foreign skilled workers after those harsh COVID lockdowns. Nearly 3 years on, has the city recovered from that blow? Well, to tell us more, we have CNA's Tan Guan. So, Guan, you have been in Shanghai for more than half a year now, I suppose. Has the city recovered from its expat exodus?
Well, when I landed, the vibe I get from the city that it's very big, it is very vibrant city. But as a newbie, one of the first things you hear from local friends and the expat community alike is that that the city was far more vibrant before. Many of them lament that there are far fewer foreigners and that there's a pool of foreign companies. But when it comes to hard numbers on the number of expats, for example, that was pretty hard to come by because the last census was like 2020. However, I was fortunate enough to catch up with a headhunter whose company made projections about the number of foreigners in Shanghai. Let's take a look.
It's just past 5 p.m. on a cold December Wednesday. In downtown Shanghai, Melissa is holding an audience of a room full of expatriates.
Current status of foreigners in China.
Melissa is a headhunter by profession. Her company studied numbers from the Shanghai Bureau of Statistics in 2018 and the 7th National Census in 2020. And they found that between those 2 years, before the pandemic and in the midst of it, the number of foreigners in Shanghai dropped over 41%. With no official numbers since then, in 2024, her company made estimates based on nationalities here that have statistics. And they found that the number of foreigners dropped even further in 2023, but made a slight recovery a year later. Still, the number of foreigners in Shanghai in 2024 is nearly halved of what it was before in 2018.
So these are not only foreigners from Western countries, but these are also foreigners from developed Asian countries. So a lot of the Japanese actually make up the largest foreign population here in Shanghai, and half of them are leaving. The same for the South Koreans and the Singaporeans, so a lot of them are leaving.
What's more, expat pay packages have also shrunk by 25%. In part driven by the emergence of multilingual Chinese nationals, some educated overseas, competing for the same shrinking executive job pie.
So for Chinese nationals, there is a lot of unemployment at the moment, and that's why it's also for employers, it's easier to find somebody on a lower salary at the moment. So a decade ago, we saw a completely different expat or foreign package here in China. There were a lot more allowances. So for example, school fees for an international school, a nice apartment and a car for the whole family. And compared to now, no school allowances, a capped housing allowance.
The drop in expat numbers, along with the drop in expat pay, is sending chills never felt before through Shanghai's upscale dining and lifestyle scene.
Hey, Guan, you ended that story of yours mentioning the chills to Shanghai's upscale dining as well as lifestyle scene. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I hope viewers will watch that documentary for the full picture. But in a nutshell, some restaurants are just simply not doing as well as before, especially those catering to foreigners. Now, I spoke to someone who is in the restaurant business, and he told me that last year being 2024, was his worst performing year. And that even during the height of COVID, the business wasn't so bad. So while some restaurants are doing brisk business, others will be half empty even on weekends, especially from those catering to expats. And it isn't just restaurants, high-end gyms and malls are all affected. Let's take a look at another excerpt from the documentary.
Will's Fitness, for example, expanded aggressively in the boom years to become Shanghai's biggest fitness chain. At one point, it boasts over 70 gyms in Shanghai alone. But now, the large majority of them are closed. Some shuttered by the mall landlords for arrears in rental and utilities.
The malls themselves are doing no better. This gigantic mall, for example, was opened more than half a year ago. It is well connected with direct access to an MRT station with 2 subway lines. Yet it has no shops open for miles and miles on end.
The mall sprouted up as part of the building boom prior to the pandemic. But with the rise of online shopping, the drop in consumer confidence, and to some extent the exodus of rich expats has led it to become a ghost mall. This is an extreme case. But empty shop fronts are not uncommon in other city center malls. So much so that mall owners are getting rather creative at disguising them to avoid their buildings from degenerating into ghost malls as well.
Yeah, well, those ghost malls look pretty depressing, and gyms closing as well. Guan, is this situation really all because of the exodus of expats?
No, it's really just exodus of expats is really just one of the reasons. Although for Shanghai, the exodus of expats is most keenly felt because it has one of the largest expat community in China. And I spoke to an expert in finance, and he tells me one of the key reasons that's dragging down consumer confidence and spending really is something else. Let's take a listen.
Probably a big factor behind this is the weak property sector. Okay, the property sector probably has a key aspect of affecting consumer confidence, in large part because for many Chinese, probably upwards of 70% of their net wealth, their net worth, was tied to the property sector. At one point a few years ago, the property sector made up almost 30% of China's GDP. No single industry should make up that large a part of China's economy. The government has been trying to slow it down and shrink it. Now, the challenge is this. It takes a long time to shift more economic development to other parts of the GDP of the economy, such as technology.
Are you going to have to say, that sounds pretty pessimistic? Tell us, are there any bright spots in this gloomy outlook?
Well, remember that person in the restaurant sector I spoke about? Well, I bumped into a manager at the same restaurant recently, and he told me that there seems to be a slow but gradual recovery in business. We must remember that Shanghai, like the rest of China, as Prof. Lin mentioned, is undergoing a huge transition out of an economy that's dependent a lot on property and export-oriented lower-end manufacturing. So now Shanghai, and like the rest of China, is trying to shift into high-tech sectors and other so-called new productive forces. In fact, today we attended a news conference by the Shanghai city authorities today, and they stressed that foreign investment is still coming into the city. Let's take a listen.
上海呢，始终是外商投资的首选地，累计实际使用外资呢，已经超过了3600亿元。刚才也讲了，我们在这个超过7.5万家的外资企业的基础上呢，去年的新设外资企业的数量又超过了5500家。实际使用的外资呢，来源于57个国家和地区，其中去年呢，欧洲等地方的对上海的投资呢，增加比较明显。高技术的制造业投资呢，在制造业中占比超过3%。上海的总部呢，去年累计认定的数超过了1000家，达到了1016家，其中大中华以上的高能级总部呢是213家，另外呢，这个世界500强企业设立的总部呢是66家。
So you see, depending on who you ask, if you ask the authorities, they'll say now the pain that we're now experiencing is much needed for this shift into new sectors. Now, as one ING economist puts it, China is not in a great decline, but in a great transition. Oteli?
Well, thanks so very much for that report. CNA's Tan Guan live from Shanghai. And you can catch his documentary on Shanghai, which is part of CNA Correspondent, on CNA.Asia, YouTube, and MeWatch. On that note, it's time to wrap up East Asia tonight this Thursday. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. Thanks for watching.